The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and something else, that special smell that only hospitals have, a mixture of medicine, sterility, and a little bit of despair. I lay on the bed, covered by a thin blanket, and stared up at the ceiling, where small cracks snaked across the plaster, forming bizarre patterns. If you looked long enough, you could make out the outlines of continents, like a geographical map. My name is Ellis Pryor. I'm 76 years old, and I had a hip replacement 3 days ago. The pain throbbed deep inside, as if someone had screwed a red-hot rod into the bone. The nurses had given me painkillers, of course, but they only dulled the sensation, turning the sharp agony into a dull, aching reminder that my body wasn't what it used to be. I tried to shift a little on the bed and immediately regretted it as a wave of pain traveled from my hip to my entire body, eliciting a quiet moan from me. "Don't move, Mrs. Pryor." Nurse Helen appeared beside me, adjusting the pillow under my head. "You need absolute rest for at least another 24 hours. I'm being discharged tomorrow," I reminded myself, trying to smile. "Yes, but under strict family supervision." She checked the clipboard on the table. Dr. Nielsen was very adamant in his prescriptions. "Have your children already confirmed that they'll take you?" "Yes, of course," I nodded, remembering the brief conversation I'd had with my son last night. Brooks had called between business meetings, his voice sounding distant, as if he were reviewing documents at the same time. "Mom, don't worry. Tabitha and I will make the arrangements. We'll pick you up tomorrow afternoon, 5 o'clock, okay? I'll order a special cab with a handicapped elevator." "I'm not handicapped, Brooks," I objected, feeling a wave of irritation rising inside me. "It's temporary, of course. It's just more convenient." I could hear the impatience in his voice. "Look, I have to run. We'll talk about it tomorrow, okay?" He disconnected before I could respond. Typical Brooks, always in a hurry, always doing something more important than talking to his mother. He's a successful lawyer specializing in corporate law, and he's a constant reminder of how much his time is valued. Everyone but me. Tabitha called later, her call even shorter. "Hey, Mom, how are you? Brooks said you're getting discharged tomorrow." "Don't worry, we'll make arrangements. The kids say hi. My grandchildren, Liam and Rebecca, probably don't even know their grandmother's in the hospital." Tabitha works at a PR agency, organizing events for the rich and famous. Her life is an endless series of meetings, phone calls, and social gatherings. There's no room for me in that circle. "Mrs. Pryor," Dr. Nielsen's voice brought me back to reality. He was standing by the bedside, studying my chart. "How are you feeling today?" Nielsen was a tall man in his 50s, with a neat graying beard and deep wrinkles around his eyes. He looked tired, but his eyes retained a lively sparkle. "It's tolerable, doctor. There's some pain, but I'm getting through it." "That's fine. We're discharging you tomorrow, but I must emphasize again the importance of following all the instructions." He looked at me over his glasses. "No independent movement, even with a walker, for the first 3 days. Only with the physical support of another person. Driving is strictly forbidden for at least 6 weeks. Do you understand?" "Yes, doctor. My children have promised to pick me up and help me with my rehabilitation." "That's good. At your age, a surgery like this is a serious strain on the body. The slightest careless movement could cause the prosthesis to dislocate or even dislocate. The consequences would be very unpleasant. A second operation, a long hospitalization. But if you follow all the recommendations, in a couple of months, you will be able to walk almost without restrictions." I nodded, remembering how I had lived with constant hip pain for the past 3 years. How I gradually reduced my walks, refused to travel, even a simple trip to the store turned into an ordeal. Osteoarthritis is a ruthless disease that slowly robs you of your mobility and joy of life. How long will I have to take pain medication? I asked, remembering how hard it had been for me to get addicted to medication. For the first 2 weeks, regularly, according to the scheme. Then we will see, he made a note in the chart. Your daughter or son should come to the emergency room by 3 p.m. tomorrow to get all the paperwork and detailed care instructions. The nurse will give them their prescriptions and medication schedule. When the doctor left, I was alone with my thoughts again. I looked out the window at the gray Birmingham sky and remembered how once upon a time, when the children were small, we were a real family. After Henry, my husband, died 20 years ago, I was left alone with two teenagers. Brooks was 15 and Tabitha was 13. I worked as an accountant for a large wholesale company, staying late, taking on extra projects to make sure the kids had a decent life. I paid for their education, helped with their first apartments, never regretted a single thing I did for them, and now I lie in a hospital room waiting for them to find time to take their mother home. Dinner arrived at 6:30. Baked fish, mashed potatoes, and carrots boiled down to a tasteless mass. Hospital food is the same everywhere, bland but nutritious. I picked at the fish with my fork, but there was no appetite. My thoughts returned again and again to tomorrow's discharge. What if they get busy again? What if they put things off to the last minute again, like they had with the Mother's Day meeting that ended up getting canceled? Or with Christmas, when they stopped by for an hour, dropped off the presents, and ran off to some urgent business? I grabbed my phone from the bedside table and dialed Brooks' number. After 5 beeps, the answering machine came on. His voice, professional and polite, said the caller was temporarily unavailable. Brooks, it's Mom, I said after the beep. I just wanted to check in about tomorrow. The doctor said you need to be here by 3 o'clock. Call me back, please. Then I dialed Tabitha. Her phone didn't answer either. After the fourth try, I gave up and put my cell phone away. The nurse brought the evening medication: painkillers, anticoagulants to prevent thrombosis, sleeping pills. I dutifully swallowed all the pills with water. Are you all right, Mrs. Pryor? The nurse asked, probably noticing the look of concern on my face. Yes, I just can't reach the children. They're probably busy getting ready for you to come home. She smiled. Don't worry, everything will be fine. If only she knew how many times I'd heard promises like that. From my kids, from neighbors, from coworkers. Everything's gonna be okay. It's amazing how people like to say that phrase without even thinking about its meaning. The night passed restlessly, despite the sleeping pills. I woke up with pain in my hip and anxious thoughts swirling around in my head. By morning, I felt shattered. Breakfast arrived at 8. Oatmeal, toast, and tea. I forced myself to eat, knowing I would need my strength. After breakfast, the physical therapist came in, a young man named Kyle, who helped me do some simple exercises while lying in bed. You're doing great, Mrs. Pryor, he praised me. You have very good mobility for the first few days after surgery. In a couple of weeks of regular exercise, you'll be walking with a cane. I'd like to believe that, I sighed. The most important thing is to take your time. Follow all the recommendations and you will be fine. Again with the "you'll be fine." I just nodded in response. At 11 o'clock, I tried calling Brooks and Tabitha again. No answer. I sent them both messages reminding them of the discharge at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. No response. The anxiety grew by the hour. At 1 p.m., a nurse came in with the discharge papers. Your relatives have to sign these papers, she explained, placing the folder on the nightstand. Did they call to say what time they'd be here? They should be here by 3, I answered, trying to make my voice sound confident. That's fine. I'll help you pack. She took my bag out of the closet and carefully put the few personal items in it: a nightgown, a robe, toiletries. What about clothes? My sister asked. You'll need to change before you're discharged. My son should bring some. I felt the color of embarrassment flood my cheeks. I'd asked Brooks to bring a comfortable tracksuit yesterday. Don't worry, if anything, we can give you a hospital gown for the ride home. After the nurse left, I took up the phone again, dialed the kids' numbers one by one, over and over. No answer. Time dragged agonizingly slow. 2 o'clock in the afternoon. 3:30. 2:15. I couldn't lie still anymore, despite the pain of every movement. Panic was growing inside. At 3 o'clock, I sent another text, this time to both kids at the same time. I'm waiting for you at the hospital. Please call. At 4:30, a nurse stopped by. Your relatives haven't arrived yet? She sounded surprised. They're probably stuck in traffic. I tried to smile, but my lips wouldn't cooperate. Don't worry, it happens. Call them again. At 4 o'clock, I couldn't hold back the tears. Neither Brooks nor Tabitha were answering their phones. Their phones were working and ringing, but no one was picking up. They just ignored me. At 5 o'clock, Dr. Nielsen came in. Mrs. Pryor, what's wrong? He frowned, seeing my crying face. Are you in pain? My children, they didn't come, I whispered, feeling incredibly stupid and humiliated. I can't reach them. Dr. Nielsen shook his head, not hiding his disappointment. That's very irresponsible of them. Your condition requires special attention. Traveling on your own is extremely dangerous for you right now, let alone driving. I nodded, swallowing my tears. A wave of panic was building inside me. What am I going to do? How do I get home? The doctor had made it clear that I wouldn't be released without an escort, but how long could I stay in the hospital? Do you have anyone else you can ask for help? The doctor asked. Other relatives, neighbors, friends? I shook my head. Since Henry's death and retirement, my social circle had narrowed to a minimum. A couple of old colleagues with whom we occasionally returned phone calls, and a neighbor, Mrs. Birch, who occasionally dropped by for tea. No one I could call to pick me up from the hospital. Could I stay here another day? I asked, swallowing my pride. Of course, don't worry about it. The doctor made a note on my chart. You can stay until tomorrow, and during that time, we will try to contact your children. After he left, I dialed Brooks and Tabitha's numbers again and again. No one answered. I left voicemails, I texted, but there was only silence in response. With each passing hour, the panic grew worse. What if they don't come tomorrow either? How long could I stay in the hospital? Sooner or later, I would have to get out of here on my own, despite the doctor's warnings. It was nearing 9 o'clock in the evening. I lay in the half-darkened room, listening to the muffled sounds of the hospital, the distant voices of nurses, the beeping of equipment, the footsteps in the corridor. The phone was silent. My children had forgotten about me. Suddenly, I felt panic turn to cold determination. If no one came for me tomorrow, I would find a way to get home on my own. After all, I've always been an independent woman, and if my own children don't see fit to take care of their mother after major surgery, then I'll have to take care of myself. I closed my eyes, trying to calm down. My heart was pounding, and my mind was racing with anxious thoughts. What to do? Who to call? How do I get out of this situation? The phone was still silent. The morning of the second day in the hospital greeted me with the same sterile odor and featureless cracked ceiling. The night passed restlessly. The pain in my hip would subside and then flare up again, preventing me from getting a full night's rest. To the physical discomfort was added mental pain, which was much more excruciating. By 8 o'clock in the morning, I was awake, listening intently to the sounds of the hospital outside the door. Nurses' footsteps, muffled conversations, the clinking of medical instruments. It all seemed so far away, as if I were watching the hospital through a column of water. Before breakfast arrived, I checked my phone for the umpteenth time. No calls, no messages. The screen remained stubbornly blank, not counting the low battery notification. Even that seemed symbolic. My connection to the outside world was fading, as was the hope that the kids would remember I existed. Nurse Helen brought breakfast and morning medication. She was friendly, but there was a pity in her eyes that I hated with all my soul. "Did your children call?" she asked, helping me to sit up higher. "No," I answered shortly, not wanting to pursue the subject. "Don't feel bad." Helen put her hand on my shoulder. "I'm sure they'll show up soon. I'm sure they have some urgent business to attend to. What could be more urgent than picking up my mother from the hospital after a major operation?" It was on the tip of my tongue, but I didn't say anything. I didn't want to look any more pathetic than I already felt. After breakfast, Dr. Nielsen showed up. He examined my hip, checking the bandage and movement in the joint. "The healing is going well, Mrs. Pryor," he said, "but I still insist on strict adherence to restrictions. The first 2 weeks are critical to the successful healing of the prosthesis." "I understand, doctor." I nodded. "What about discharge?" Nielsen sighed, taking off his glasses and wiping them with a tissue, a gesture that suggested a certain awkwardness. "We contacted your son this morning," he said finally. "He promised to be here by noon." A spark of hope flared inside me, but I snuffed it out. Too many times Brooks had made promises he hadn't kept. "Thank you," I said dryly. "I'll be waiting." The time dragged unbearably slow. I tried to read the journal left by the previous patient, but the lines blurred before my eyes. My thoughts kept returning to my children. How did we get to this point? When had the gulf between us become unbridgeable? By 11 o'clock, I called Brooks again. It was ringing, and again it went to voicemail. Tabitha didn't answer either. At 12 o'clock, I called the nurse's station and asked if there were any calls for me. The answer was no. At 1 o'clock, I made a decision. I will not wait any longer. I will not sit here like an old suitcase forgotten by everyone else in a storage locker. If my children don't see fit to take care of me, I'll take care of myself. I pressed the nurse call button. A young girl came in, not Helen, but a different one, with short cropped hair and freckles on her nose. "I need my discharge papers," I said firmly. "I'm leaving the hospital today." "But, Mrs. Pryor," the girl said confused, "Dr. Nielsen said your relatives have to pick you up. You can't go off on your own." "I am aware of my condition," I interrupted her, "and I take full responsibility. Please bring my papers and clothes." "I need to talk to the doctor." She rushed out of the room without waiting for my response. 15 minutes later, Dr. Nielsen arrived. He had a look of extreme disapproval on his face. "Mrs. Pryor, this is very irresponsible," he began. "In your condition, moving about on your own could lead to serious complications. I strongly advise you to wait for relatives or let us call a social worker." "Dr. Nielsen," I looked him straight in the eye. "I appreciate your concern, but I've been here an extra day, and my kids haven't even bothered to call. I can't and won't stay here any longer. I'm a sane adult, and I have the right to self-determination." He looked at me for a long moment, then sighed heavily. "Okay, but I'm going to have to ask you to sign a waiver of liability, and I insist that you use medical transportation." "I'll call a cab," I said, feeling my resolve growing inside. "At least let the nurse help you get dressed and downstairs." It was no longer a suggestion, but a demand. I agreed. An hour later, having signed all the necessary paperwork and received my prescriptions and orders, I was already sitting in the wheelchair, which the nurse was wheeling toward the hospital exit. My belongings fit into one small bag, which was carried on my lap. At the entrance to the hospital, the nurse helped me stand up and lean on the walker I had been given in the ward. "Let me call you a cab," he suggested. "Thanks, I already did," I lied. I hadn't really decided how I was going to get there, but I didn't want any more delays. The nurse nodded, and after making sure I was standing steadily, went back into the building. I was alone in front of the hospital entrance, leaning on my walker and feeling the fear and uncertainty come up to my throat again. What am I doing? How am I going to get home in this condition? Every movement hurt in my hip, and I knew that Dr. Nielsen was right, that moving around on my own in my condition was pure madness. But I wasn't going back. Taking a deep breath, I pulled out my phone and ordered a cab through the app. Luckily, it still had some charge left in it. The cab arrived 10 minutes later, an ordinary sedan, not designed to transport people with limited mobility. The driver, a middle-aged man with a thick beard, looked at me and my walker with surprise. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked as he got out of the car. "Yes, please." I handed him my bag. "And I don't need to go home." I gave him the address of a car service about 20 minutes from the hospital. The driver raised his eyebrows in surprise, but didn't say anything. He helped me into the back seat, folded up the walker, and put it in the trunk. Every movement hurt, but I gritted my teeth and endured. As I climbed into the seat, I felt a sharp stab in my thigh, so sharp that my eyes went black for a second. But I didn't let myself give up. In the cab, I closed my eyes and tried to breathe steady, fighting the nausea and dizziness. The painkiller pills I'd taken before I was discharged were barely helping. The drive to the car rental seemed endless. Every bump, every turn, every twist and turn was an excruciating pain in my hip. I tried to distract myself by looking out the window at Birmingham whizzing by. Gray buildings, people rushing by, the usual city bustle. All these people were living their lives, unaware of my little personal drama. Finally, the cab stopped in front of an unassuming one-story building with a brightly colored sign that read, "Ryder Car Rentals." The driver helped me out of the car and pulled out a walker. "Are you sure you want to rent a car?" he asked, looking at my walker with obvious doubt. "Yes, quite sure," I replied, paying and adding a generous tip for my help. Inside the car rental office was cool and empty, with only a young man behind the counter and a girl talking on the phone in the far corner. As I made my way to the counter with my walker, I could feel their perplexed looks on my face. Each step was very difficult. The pain throbbed in my hip, but I stubbornly kept walking. "What can I do for you?" the young man asked when I finally reached the counter. "I need a car. For 3 days." I tried to keep my voice steady. He took one look at me, a gray-haired woman with a walker, clearly fresh from the hospital, and frowned. "I'm sorry, but are you sure you can drive the car?" "I'm absolutely sure." I pulled my wallet out of my bag. "Here's my license and credit card." "Ma'am, I'm not sure. Do you have a legal basis for refusing to rent me a car?" I asked, remembering my business negotiation skills. "My paperwork is in order. My license is valid. My credit history is spotless. Or are you discriminating against me based on my age?" The young man blushed and mumbled something unintelligible. Then, apparently deciding that it was easier to fulfill my request than to argue, he began to draw up the documents. "What model do you want? We have compact sedans, SUVs." "Something small and easy to drive," I said, "and preferably with an automatic transmission." Half an hour later, having signed all the documents and paid the deposit, I got the keys to a small blue Ford. The young man offered to walk me to the car, but I refused. The last thing I needed was another witness to my clumsy attempt to drive. Stepping out into the parking lot, I looked around carefully. Thankfully, there were no people around. The car was parked a few meters from the entrance, not much, but for me with my walker, the distance seemed like a marathon. Step by step, overcoming the pain, I reached the car. Now, the hardest part was getting behind the wheel. I leaned the walker against the car door and, holding tightly to the handle, tried to lower myself onto the seat. The first attempt failed. A sharp pain pierced my thigh, and I nearly fell. The second was a little better. On the third attempt, I managed to lower myself onto the seat, but the pain made tears spurt from my eyes. After catching my breath, I folded up the walker and struggled to get it into the back seat. Then I closed the door and just sat there for a few minutes, catching my breath and fighting the nausea. What am I doing? Why am I risking my health? The answer came immediately, without thought, because I have no choice, because my own children left me in the lurch. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror, a pale face covered in sweat, lips pressed together in pain, stubborn determination in my eyes. I can do this. I always have. Starting the engine, I carefully drove the car out of the parking lot. Driving the car wasn't as difficult as I'd feared. Sure, every press of the gas or brake pedal hurt my hip, but it was bearable. Slowly, much slower than the normal flow of traffic, I moved through the streets of Birmingham. Cars overtook me. Drivers sometimes honked irritably, but I didn't care. The important thing was to get home. On the way, I remembered how I'd taught Brooks to drive a long time ago. He was 16 and had just gotten his provisional license. We'd take to the deserted streets on an early Sunday morning. He was so nervous behind the wheel, and I was infinitely patient. "Mom, what if I don't make it?" he'd ask, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. "You'll be fine, honey," I said. "I'm here for you. I'll always be there for you when you need me." The bitter irony of those words now echoed in my heart. I was always there for them when they needed me. When Tabitha was in a bike accident and broke her arm, I took a leave of absence from work and took care of her for 2 weeks. When Brooks was having trouble in college, I found and paid for the best tutors. When Tabitha was divorcing her first husband, I babysat little Liam while she did paperwork and met with lawyers. And now, when I needed their help, they just disappeared. It was like I never existed, as if all those years of caring and self-denial had meant nothing. The feeling of betrayal came over me with renewed force. Tears came to my eyes again, but I resolutely brushed them away. This was no time for weakness. I needed to focus on the road. The traffic was getting heavier, and I was approaching the center of town. My home was in a quiet suburb of Birmingham, still about half an hour away. The pain in my hip was getting worse by the minute, but I stubbornly continued on my way. At a stoplight, I took advantage of the pause to check my phone. The battery was almost dead, but I managed to see 2 missed calls from Tabitha. No messages, just calls. Well, now they remembered I existed. Maybe they finally made it to the hospital and discovered I wasn't there. What are they feeling right now? Anxiety? Irritation? Or just embarrassment at having to explain themselves to Dr. Nielsen? I suddenly didn't care. Whatever their feelings were, they couldn't compare to what I was feeling as I sat in the hospital, waiting in vain for them to show up. The traffic light turned green, and I started up again. In a little while, I would be home, within my own walls, where I could finally rest and recover. But the thought of home brought on a new wave of anxiety. How would I cope on my own? Would I be able to climb stairs, cook, take a shower? Dr. Nielsen was right. I need help in the first few days after surgery. Maybe my neighbor, Mrs. Birch, would agree to stop by a couple of times a day to help with the essentials. Or I could hire a caregiver for a few hours a day. I had money, small savings from the sale of our family business after Henry's death. I'd always been frugal and saved for a rainy day, and it looked like that day had come. The last few kilometers were especially hard. The pain in my hip was almost unbearable. Sweat was rolling down my face, and my hands were shaking with exertion. But I didn't let myself stop. Only forward, only home. Finally, I turned onto a familiar street of neat one-story houses. Mine was the third one on the right, with a small garden out front and an old apple tree by the fence. The house where I'd lived for the past 30 years. The house where my children grew up. I parked slowly at the curb, careful not to hit any other cars. Shutting off the engine, I just sat there for a few minutes, catching my breath and gathering my strength for the final push from the car to the front door. The children's betrayal had hurt deeply, but I was determined not to give up. If they don't want to be a part of my life, that's their choice, but I won't let their indifference break me. I'll make it on my own, just like I always have. With that thought, I opened the car door and began to slowly, painfully climb out, preparing for the last part of my difficult journey. Getting out of the car was harder than I'd anticipated. Every movement felt like a sharp pain in my hip, and for a moment I wondered if I'd made an irreparable mistake by going on this journey unaccompanied. But there was no turning back. I slowly straightened up, leaning against the car door, and let myself catch my breath before retrieving the walker from the back seat. My house had never seemed so far away, even though it was only about 10 meters from the car to the porch. The path that I usually ran through in seconds now seemed like an insurmountable obstacle. Step by step, leaning on my walker, I covered the distance, gritting my teeth in pain and stubbornly staring ahead. The day was drawing towards evening. The sun was already sinking behind the rooftops, coloring the sky orange and pink. At other times, I would have stopped to admire the sight, but now all my energy was spent just moving forward. Finally, I reached the porch. 3 steps up was another challenge. I left the walker at the base of the steps and, holding onto the railing, began to climb slowly, shuffling my feet with the care of a newborn foal. Once on the porch, I leaned against the wall of the house, trying to regain my breath. Pain throbbed in my thigh, but the sense of relief that I was almost home outweighed the physical pain. Just a little longer, and I could get into my bed, drink my medicine, and finally get some rest. I reached into my bag for my keys. They were always in the small inside pocket, but this time my hand didn't find the familiar bunch. I tried to look inside the bag, rummaging through my belongings with increasing anxiety. There were no keys. At first, I thought I'd forgotten them at the hospital, or in a cab, or in a rental car. I thought of all the places I could have left them, but then I remembered. Brooks had to have them. I'd given him a spare set years ago so he could come in when I wasn't feeling well, and the main set was in the bag I'd packed for the hospital. The bag Brooks was supposed to bring. I took a deep breath, trying to deal with the rising panic. It wasn't a big deal. The spare key was hidden under a flower pot to the right of the door, an old-fashioned precaution my kids made fun of, but one that had saved me more than once when I'd forgotten my keys. I leaned over, writhing in pain, and pushed the pot of geraniums away. It was empty, no key. Weird. Maybe I'd put it under another pot. I examined all the flower pots on the porch, looked under the doormat by the door, checked all the places where the key might have been hidden. Nothing. The last option was to ring the doorbell. Maybe Brooks or Tabitha were inside. Maybe they'd decided to visit after hearing about my discharge after all. I pressed the bell button and heard a familiar tune echoing through the house. Once, twice, a third time, I rang persistently, listening to the silence of the house. No answer. Then I knocked on the door, gently at first, then harder. The knock echoed through the empty house, but no one answered. Despair began to rise in my throat. What am I supposed to do now? Sleep on the porch? Call a locksmith? Go to a hotel? Each option seemed unrealistic in my condition. I pulled out my phone, intending to call Brooks, but the screen remained dark. The battery was completely dead. I clutched the useless device helplessly in my hand. At that moment, movement outside the living room window caught my attention. A shadow flickered, and I saw the curtain move slightly, then fall back into place. Someone was in the house. Brooks? I called out, knocking on the door again. Tabitha, it's me. Open up. Silence. I walked around the house, holding onto the wall for support, and peered through the kitchen window. Someone was definitely in there. There were cups and plates on the table, which hadn't been there when I'd left for the hospital. Back at the front door, I knocked again, my anger rising. I know you're in there. Open up at once. Finally, the curtain in the window next to the door pulled back, and I saw Brooks's face. He looked annoyed and guilty. Something like shame flashed in his eyes for a moment, but it was immediately replaced by cold determination. Mom? His voice sounded muffled through the glass. What are you doing here? What am I doing here? I couldn't believe my ears. I live here. Open the door. Brooks shook his head. I can't, Mom. You shouldn't be here. What are you talking about? This is my house. Look, he said slowly, as if explaining something to a child. Tabitha and I talked it over. You can't live alone after this operation. We've made arrangements with an old people's home to take care of you. I stared at him, unable to believe what I was hearing. A boarding house? My voice shook with indignation. I didn't agree to any boarding house. Open the door now. Brooks didn't move. Mom, it's a done deal. Tabitha and I can't take care of you. We have our own lives, and after the surgery, you need constant care, which you haven't even bothered to provide since you took me out of the hospital. I felt the anger rising up inside me, pushing out the pain and fatigue. Open the damn door, Brooks. Now. No, he shook his head. Go back to the hospital. We'll sort out the formalities with the boarding house in the next few days. The locks, it suddenly dawned on me. You changed the locks on my house. Brooks didn't answer, but his look confirmed my guess. How dare you? I was furious. What right do you have to take over my house? The right of the people who care about your well-being. Brooks replied with feigned confidence. You need care, Mom. Professional care. I need my kids to show me some basic respect and care. I was practically screaming. Open the door, Brooks. At that moment, Tabitha appeared behind him. She looked worried and avoided making eye contact with me, too. What's going on? She asked her brother. Mom somehow got here from the hospital, Brooks answered. I explained to her that she needs to go back and wait for us to arrange for her transfer to the boarding house. Tabitha. I turned to my daughter, trying to appeal to her conscience. Please open the door. I'm tired, I'm in pain, I need to take my medication and rest. Tabitha looked helplessly at Brooks, then back at me. Mom, we really mean well. Sunny Hills Boarding House is a great place. The care there is excellent. The medical staff. I'm not going to any boarding house. I slammed my fist on the door, ignoring the pain in my joints. This is my home. I didn't give you permission to dispose of my life. But you can't live alone, Brooks repeated stubbornly. You're 76. You've had major surgery. So what? I'm sane. I'm competent. I can decide where and how I want to live. If you're so sane, Brooks said sarcastically, then why did you run away from the hospital and drive yourself after the surgery? You're not only endangering yourself, you're endangering others. It's irresponsible and proves you can't make intelligent decisions. I got behind the wheel because you abandoned me. I was outraged and out of breath. You promised to pick me up and you never showed up. What was I supposed to do? Wait for us to arrange for your transportation to the boarding house. Tabitha intervened. We've been working on it, looking for the best place. You're lying. I shook my head. You just want to get rid of me. Admit it. Brooks and Tabitha looked at each other, and in that look, I could read everything I needed to know. They really did want to get rid of me. I was a burden, an inconvenient reminder of a responsibility they didn't want to bear. Mom, Brooks's voice grew harsher. You need to leave. We won't let you in until all the paperwork for the boarding house is done. It's for your own good. For my own good? I laughed bitterly. Since when do you think about my good? You didn't even bother to call me when I was waiting for you at the hospital. We had things to do. Brooks snapped at me. We can't give up everything for your whims. Whims? I gasped in indignation. A major surgery is a whim? Look, he was getting impatient. I don't have time for this drama. Go back to the hospital or call a cab to the hotel. But you're not coming in here. We've already filed papers to declare you partially incapacitated due to your age and health. This blow was so sudden that I was speechless for a moment. What did you do? It's a necessary measure. Tabitha intervened, clearly feeling uncomfortable. Dr. Nielsen had confirmed that you needed supervision, and you refused to admit it. The betrayal was so deep, so absolute, that I felt the pain physically pierce my heart. You want to take away my right to control my life? I whispered. My house? My money? They were silent, but their looks spoke for themselves. Get out, Brooks said suddenly, his voice cold and determined. Get out of here, Mom. We've made up our minds. Brooks, Tabitha shouted at him, shocked by his brother's bluntness. What? He turned to her. We both know where this is going. She won't go to the boarding house voluntarily, and we have to settle the house by the end of the month if we want to sell it. Sell it? I'm out of breath. You want to sell my house? Tabitha threw Brooks an annihilating glare, but it was too late. The cards were dealt. Mom, it's not what you think, she began, but I interrupted her. No, it's exactly what I think. You want to send me to boarding school, sell my house, and, I suppose, embezzle the money. It's as simple as that. They were silent, unable to refute the obvious. I'm not going anywhere, I said firmly. This is my home, and I'm staying here. No, you won't. Brooks' eyes narrowed. I'll call the police if I have to. The police? On your mother? You're trespassing on private property. He spoke coldly, as if to a stranger. You don't have keys. You don't live here anymore. I've lived here for 30 years, I exclaimed. This is my home. No more. The papers had already been transferred to Tabitha and me as guardians. It was too much. Rage, pain, fatigue, all mixed into one horrible cocktail. Black dots swam in front of my eyes. Get out, Brooks shouted, and there was no more filial love in his voice. Get out, or I'm calling the police. I swayed. The pain in my hips suddenly became unbearable, and nausea came to my throat. My eyes went black. Yeah, I'm your mother, I whispered, feeling my knees weaken. How can you? The last thing I saw was Brooks's face cold, determined, with a faint shadow of shame in his eyes. Then the world went dark. I woke up to the sound of sirens. There were uniformed men scurrying around, someone holding my arm, checking my pulse. The bright light was stabbing my eyes. Mrs. Pryor, can you hear me? The voice was young, professional, and concerned. I tried to nod, but my head felt incredibly heavy. Slowly focusing my eyes, I realized I was lying on a stretcher with an ambulance crew all around me. What? What? What happened? My voice was hoarse, barely audible. You passed out, the young EMT explained. Your neighbor called the ambulance when she saw you fall on the porch. Mrs. Birch. She must have seen the whole thing from her window. God bless her. We're going to take you to the hospital, the EMT continued, securing the straps on the stretcher. Your blood pressure is very low, and we're concerned about your prosthesis. You recently underwent hip surgery, correct? I nodded weakly. 3 days ago. The medic exchanged worried glances with his colleague. And you were driving? I had no choice, I whispered, tears welling up in my eyes. It's okay, Mrs. Pryor. He squeezed my hand gently. We'll take care of you. The stretcher was lifted and rolled to the ambulance. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Brooks and Tabitha standing off to the side. They didn't approach me, didn't ask how I was feeling, just watched from a safe distance as strangers loaded their mother into the ambulance. For a moment, our eyes met Tabitha's. There was something akin to remorse in her gaze, but she quickly averted her eyes. Brooks, on the other hand, looked cold and detached, as if he were watching furniture being loaded, not his mother being taken away. In the ambulance, I was put on an IV and hooked up to a monitor. The young medic, I could now make out the name on the badge, Oliver, kept asking questions about my condition, the surgery, the medications. I answered automatically, my thoughts jumbled. My children had betrayed me. They wanted to take away my home, my independence, my dignity. They planned this while I was in the hospital, worrying about why they weren't coming. Do you have someone we can notify? Oliver asked. Relatives? Friends? No, I shook my head, and that simple truth was prouder than any tears. No one. At the hospital, they sent me straight to X-ray. The doctor examining the scans frowned and shook his head. Mrs. Pryor, your denture is starting to dislocate, he finally said. This is a serious complication that may require a second surgery. I closed my eyes, feeling fatigue wash over me. Of course, I knew I was risking my health by driving after the surgery. But what could I do? I was placed in a room and hooked up to an IV with antibiotics and painkillers. Soon, Dr. Nielsen, the same one who had discharged me from the hospital, showed up. He looked disappointed. Mrs. Pryor, he began, sitting down on the edge of the bed, I understand that you're in a difficult situation, but you've taken a serious risk with your health. Driving an automobile after such an operation could have had far more serious consequences. I know, doctor. My voice sounded lifeless, but I had no choice. There's always a choice, he said softly. You could have come to us for help. We could have arranged for a social worker, medical transportation. And then? I looked him straight in the eye. Where would they take me? To a boarding house where my children could forget I existed? To a house they planned to sell? Nielsen was silent, not knowing what to say. Your children have spoken to me, he said at last. They are concerned about your condition and think you need professional care. All they care about is getting rid of me and getting my house. I felt bitter. They didn't even come to pick me up from the hospital when they promised. Dr. Nielsen sighed, clearly not wanting to get involved in the family conflict. Your health is the most important thing right now, Mrs. Pryor. We will monitor the condition of the prosthesis over the next few days. If the misalignment continues, we may need to correct it. How long will I be here this time? At least a week, he answered. And after you are discharged, you will absolutely need nursing care. In your condition, you can't live on your own. I turned back to the window, tears rolling down my cheeks. A week in the hospital. And then what? A boarding house? A nursing home? A place where I would slowly fade away, forgotten by everyone? We'll discuss the options later. Dr. Nielsen patted me gently on the arm and walked out. Left alone, I let the tears flow freely. I cried for the betrayal, for the lost home, for the shattered illusions of familial love. I cried for myself, an old woman abandoned by her own children. But gradually, through the veil of tears, something new began to sprout in me. Not despair, not self-pity, but a cold, hard resolve. I remembered Brooks' face when he'd yelled, "Get out!" at me. I remembered them talking about selling my house, declaring me incompetent. No, I'm not going to let them do that to me. I will not sit quietly in the corner, waiting for my fate. I will fight. The tears dried and were replaced by crystal clear clarity of thought. My children wanted a war? They will have it. I'm not going to be a victim of their selfishness and greed. For the first time in a long time, I felt my lips stretch into a smile. Let them think they've won. Let them think I'm a weak, helpless old woman. They don't know what I'm capable of yet. I closed my eyes and a plan began to form in my head. The first step was to know my rights. The second was to find allies. Step 3 is to strike when they least expect it. I would no longer be the victim. I will be the one in control. And my children will soon regret the day they decided to betray their mother. My third day in the hospital was particularly difficult. The pain in my hip had gotten worse, despite the painkillers, and my mood had plummeted to a critical point. Neither Brooks nor Tabitha visited me or even called me. It was like I ceased to exist for them. The nurses came by on schedule, changing IVs, checking my blood pressure, but those brief visits were followed by long hours of loneliness. I lay staring at the ceiling and thought about how I would fight for my life, for my dignity, but the thoughts were shattered by the harsh reality. I was an old woman in a hospital bed, with no support, no resources, no plan. By noon, another bed was rolled into the room. The nurse explained that because of the influx of patients, some rooms had to be made double rooms. I didn't mind, at least some variety in the endless monotony of hospital days. Soon my neighbor was brought in, a woman of about 65, with a bandaged head and bruises on her face. Her name was Irene Foster, and, as I learned later, she had been in a car accident. Irene wasn't much of a talker. Most of the time, she dozed off on painkillers, but occasionally her daughter came to see her. A tall woman in her 40s, with a short haircut and attentive gray eyes. She introduced herself as Noreen. The first day, Noreen just nodded at me and focused on her mother. But the next morning, when I tried unsuccessfully to reach the glass of water on the bedside table, she came over and helped me. "Thank you," I said, gratefully accepting the glass. "The nurses always put it too far away." "They're always in a hurry." Noreen nodded, sitting down on the edge of my bed. "I'm Noreen Foster, Irene's daughter." "Ellis Pryor." I held out my hand. "It's nice to meet you, even though the circumstances aren't the happiest." Noreen shook my hand, a firm, confident handshake. "I never thought I'd spend so much time in hospitals." She sighed. "But lately it's become my second job." "Does your mom get sick a lot?" I asked, glad to be able to talk to someone other than the medical staff. "No, the accident was the first serious case." Noreen shook her head. "But my dad had cancer. He spent the last 2 years of his life in hospitals. And now, my mom." "I'm sorry," I said sincerely. "It must have been hard for you." "It was." She looked thoughtfully at her sleeping mother. "But I managed. I had no choice." I heard my own thoughts echoing in her words. I didn't have a choice either when I was left alone with 2 children after my husband died, or when I decided to drive myself home after surgery. "Do you get many visitors?" Noreen asked, noticing the empty shelf of flowers and cards by my bed. I grinned bitterly. "No, my children are too busy with their own lives to visit their old mother." Something in my tone made Noreen look at me more closely. "Do they even call?" "No," I shook my head. We have a complicated relationship." I hadn't meant to spill my guts to a stranger, but Noreen's eyes were so genuinely involved that the words came out of my mouth. I told her about how the kids hadn't come to pick me up after the surgery, how I'd risked my health to get home, and how I'd discovered they'd changed the locks and were planning to send me to a boarding house and sell the house. As I spoke, Noreen's face grew more and more serious. When I finished, she was silent for a while, as if digesting what she had heard. "It's not just a complicated relationship, Mrs. Pryor," she said at last. "What your children have done could have serious legal consequences." "Legal?" I looked at her puzzled. "Yes," Noreen nodded. "You see, I'm a medical malpractice lawyer. I specialize in medical malpractice cases, but I also handle neglect cases for elderly relatives." I blinked, not believing my ears. A medical lawyer? Here in my room? What you described, Noreen continued, is a classic case of abandonment. Your children knew about your condition, the contraindications to walking and driving. They promised to pick you up and failed to do so, putting your life at risk. But they'll say it was my own fault, I objected, that I should have waited for them to arrange for my transfer to a boarding house. A boarding house you didn't know about or consent to. Noreen shook her head. No, Mrs. Pryor, what they did was irresponsible and illegal, and we can prove it. We? I looked at her with growing hope. If you want my help, Noreen smiled, and there was something predatory in her smile. I don't tolerate children neglecting their elderly parents, especially when they do it for selfish reasons. In that moment, something changed inside me. It was as if the heavy weight that had been weighing on my shoulders since the day I was alone outside the hospital began to loosen. I had an ally, maybe even a chance. I'm not sure I can afford a lawyer, I began, but Noreen stopped me with a gesture. Don't worry about that. If we win the case, and we will, your children will pay all the legal fees. And if we don't, let's just say I'll take the case pro bono. On principle. I could hardly contain my tears of gratitude. For the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. Noreen wasted no time. The very next day, she brought a folder with documents and a tape recorder. We need to gather all the evidence, she explained, laying out the papers on the bedside table. Medical orders, phone records, statements from doctors and nurses. But I don't have any of that, I said, confused. My phone was dead, and the medical records were left at home. Don't worry. Noreen was full of energy. We can get the medical orders here at the hospital. They should have copies of everything you were given when you were discharged. And as for phone records, she pulled a small tablet out of her bag and opened some kind of app. If you remember your children's numbers, we can request call detail from the carrier. It'll show how many times you tried to call them and how many times they ignored your calls. I dictated Brooks and Tabitha's numbers, feeling strangely satisfied that their indifference could now be turned against them. Great. Noreen made notes. Now we need statements from the medical staff. Can any of the doctors or nurses confirm that your children promised to pick you up and didn't show up? I remembered Dr. Nielsen and Nurse Helen, who had witnessed my long wait on discharge day. Yes, I nodded. Dr. Nielsen and Nurse Helen. They both know that my children were supposed to come and didn't. Excellent. Noreen made another note. I'll have a word with them. Doctors don't usually like to get involved in family conflicts, but when patient safety is at stake, they often change their minds. The next few days passed in feverish activity. Noreen came twice a day, in the morning, before work, and in the evening, afterward. She brought new documents, talked about her progress in gathering evidence, made plans. Every day my confidence grew. Noreen wasn't just a competent lawyer. She was a bulldog who was hooked on the case and wouldn't let go. She secured a meeting with Dr. Nielsen, obtained copies of all my medical orders, including a strict driving ban, and even found surveillance footage from the hospital that showed me waiting at the exit, occasionally glancing at my watch. We have a very strong case developing, Mrs. Pryor, she said on the fifth day, reviewing the materials she had gathered. Endangerment is a serious charge, especially when you're talking about an elderly person after surgery. Add to that attempted unlawful possession of your property, and your children are in very serious trouble. I sat up in bed, leaning back against the pillows, and listened to Noreen with a growing sense of triumph. But one thought kept me on my toes. What about the papers declaring me incompetent? I asked. Brooks said they'd already filed some papers. Noreen's face grew serious. That's the hardest part. I checked they've actually started the process of filing for guardianship of you based on your age and medical condition. My heart dropped. You mean they could win? They could, Noreen smiled. if they hadn't made a few critical mistakes. First, they started the trial without your knowledge, which would already raise questions for the court. Second, Dr. Nielsen never gave an opinion on your incapacity. His opinion was only about your need for post-operative care, which is a different matter. And third, and most importantly, she paused, clearly savoring the moment. Third, they started the process of selling your house before the guardianship was granted, and that's fraud. A sale? I gasped in indignation. They're already trying to sell my house? Yes, Noreen nodded. I checked the real estate registry. They placed a pre-foreclosure notice 3 days ago. The price is well below market value. They seem to be in a hurry to get rid of the house. I clenched my fists in anger. So they weren't even going to wait for a formal custody judgment. They just decided I wasn't coming home and started dividing up my possessions. But how could they sell a house that didn't belong to them? I asked, trying to understand their logic. They have copies of your keys, and they probably figure they'll have time to find a buyer and get everything ready for sale while the guardianship is being processed, Noreen explained. Once they get custody, they can sign the papers on your behalf. But the fact that they've already put the house on the market without the legal right to do so plays into our hands. She opened her clipboard and showed me the listing. My house was there, a cozy one-story cottage with a garden and an apple tree by the fence. The house I'd lived in for 30 years. The house my children now wanted to sell without my consent. And now what? I asked, feeling a cold resolve growing inside. Now we strike back. Noreen slammed the file folder shut. Tomorrow, I'm filing an attempted fraud and abandonment petition with the court. I'm also filing a motion to immediately terminate your incapacity proceedings. With the evidence we have, the court will likely issue a restraining order against any action on your property until the circumstances are clarified. And my children? What will happen to them? That depends on how far you're willing to go. Noreen looked at me carefully. We can limit ourselves to a civil suit that will force them to give you back the keys to the house and stop trying to dispose of your property. Or, I pushed forward, despite the pain in my hip. Or we could file a criminal complaint for abandonment. Given your age and your post-op condition, that's a serious charge. They could get probation, a fine, and possibly actual imprisonment, though the latter is unlikely for a first offense. I wondered, did I want my children to have a criminal record? Despite their betrayal, they were still my children. But then I remembered Brooks' face as he yelled, "Get out!" at me, and his indifferent look as the ambulance wheeled me away. I remembered how they planned to send me to boarding school without my consent, how they started selling my house behind my back. Let's start with the civil suit, I decided, but keep the criminal complaint ready. If they don't come to their senses, we'll use that too. Noreen nodded respectfully. Fair enough. Let's give them a chance to reform before we bring the full weight of the law down on them. At that moment, a nurse entered the room with the evening medication. Noreen gathered her papers and stood up. I must be off, she said. Get some rest, Mrs. Pryor. Tomorrow will be a big day. When she left, I took my medication and leaned back on the pillows, feeling a strange mixture of emotions. The bitterness of the children's betrayal still burned in my heart, but there was something new to it now, the anticipation of justice. Perhaps for the first time in a long time, I was back in control of my life. I closed my eyes and pictured Brooks and Tabitha's faces when they received the court notice. I imagined their shock, their panic, their hurried attempts to justify themselves. And for the first time in days, I smiled. The next morning, Noreen arrived earlier than usual. Her face was serious, almost grim. What's wrong? I asked, feeling my insides tighten with the anticipation of more bad news. I did some additional checks, Noreen said, sitting down on the edge of my bed. Mrs. Pryor, do you have a bank account savings? Of course, I nodded. I have savings from the sale of our family business after my husband died. Not a lot, but enough to live comfortably. And do your children have access to those accounts? No, I answered confidently. But then I thought about it. I mean, Brooks has a power of attorney for emergencies. I had it years ago when I was in the hospital with pneumonia, but he can only use it if I'm incapacitated. Noreen took a piece of paper out of the folder and handed it to me. I'm afraid your son has interpreted the term emergency very broadly. I took the document and ran my eyes over the lines. It was my bank statement from last month, and there were two large withdrawals, one for £5,000, the other for $10,000. Both were from the last week I'd been in the hospital. It can't be, I whispered, feeling the blood drain from my face. I've never withdrawn that much. You didn't, Noreen said softly. Your son did, using a power of attorney. He probably claimed you were incapacitated and unable to handle your finances. I stared at the figures, unable to believe what was happening. £15,000, almost a third of my entire savings, had disappeared, stolen by my own son. He he stole my money, I breathed out, feeling a wave of rage rising inside me. My money! Technically, he used the power of attorney you gave him, Noreen clarified, but he did it fraudulently, claiming you were incapacitated when you weren't, and that's already fraud. She tucked the statement back into the folder. Mrs. Pryor, I think we should rethink our strategy. Given these new circumstances, I would recommend that we file both civil and criminal charges at once. It's no longer just about abandonment, it's about financial fraud. I sat in silence, trying to comprehend the magnitude of the betrayal. My children didn't just want to get rid of me and sell my house. They had already started embezzling my money while I lay in the hospital, helpless and alone. Do what you think is right, I said finally, my voice sounding unusually harsh, even for me. I want them to answer for everything. Noreen nodded understandingly. I'll file the papers today. And, Mrs. Pryor, I'm sorry you're going through this. You don't have to be. I straightened, feeling determination fill every cell in my body. I'm grateful for your help and for opening my eyes. Now I know who my children really are, and they will know who I am very soon. The official investigation began 3 days after Noreen filed the lawsuits in court. I was still in the hospital, but my condition had improved considerably. The misalignment of the prosthesis had been corrected without a second surgery, and the doctors were talking about a speedy discharge. The question of where I would go after the hospital was still open. There was no point in going back to the house where the locks had been changed, and I had no other options. In the morning, Noreen came into the room, and I could tell from her radiant face that there was good news. The court has accepted our lawsuits and granted a preliminary injunction against any transactions with your property, she said, sitting down on the edge of my bed. That means your children can't sell the house or withdraw money from your accounts while the investigation is ongoing. I breathed a sigh of relief. At least my savings were safe. What was left of them after Brooks' intervention? What's next? I asked. Next is where it gets interesting. Noreen opened her invariable clipboard. The police have already interviewed Dr. Nielsen and the nurses, who confirmed that your children knew about your condition and the need for escorts after the surgery. Brooks and Tabitha themselves will be questioned today. Do they know it was me who initiated the investigation? Of course, Noreen nodded. They received copies of the lawsuits last night. I have to say, the reaction was violent. I pictured Brooks and Tabitha receiving the court notices. Their shock, disbelief, maybe even fear. Did I gloat? Maybe a little. But the predominant feeling was more sadness. Sadness that our relationship had reached this point. Your son called me almost as soon as he received the papers. Noreen continued. He was very aggressive, threatening a countersuit for slander. I reminded him that we had proof of all the allegations and advised him to find a good lawyer. And Tabitha? I asked, thinking of my daughter, who had always been softer than her brother. No calls from her. Noreen shook her head. But from the looks of it, they're both in a panic right now, and this is just the beginning. She wasn't exaggerating. By evening, it was already known that the police had questioned both Brooks and Tabitha. Noreen, who had sources in law enforcement, gave me the details. Your son was defiant, she said, returning from her mother, who was about to be discharged. He denied all accusations, claiming that he was acting solely in your interests, said you had become inadequate because of age and illness, and he was forced to take control of the situation. Inadequate? The outrage boiled up inside of me. I've been more adequate than him my whole life. That's exactly what Dr. Nielsen said when he was asked about your mental state. Noreen smiled. He confirmed that you are fully capable and there are no signs of dementia or other mental disorders. That really undermined Brooks' position. And Tabitha? I asked about my daughter again. She was more interesting. Noreen crouched on the edge of the bed. She was clearly nervous and contradicted herself several times. First, she claimed she didn't know about her brother's plans to sell the house and your money. Then she admitted that she knew, but didn't approve of his actions. Finally, she cried and said she just wanted you to be properly cared for. I felt a prick of pity for my daughter, but quickly suppressed it. This is not the time for sentimentality. Both of your children have been released on their own recognizance, Noreen continued. The investigation is ongoing, but it's already clear that they're in serious trouble, and those problems didn't last long. The next day, Noreen brought in the local newspaper, where on page 3 there was a small but prominent article headlined, Lawyer and PR Specialist Accused of Leaving Mother in Danger. No names were mentioned because of the ongoing investigation, but to those who knew Brooks and Tabitha, the identities of the men involved were obvious. News travels fast in a small town, Noreen commented, watching my reaction to the article. I read about myself, an elderly woman who recently underwent hip surgery, and my children, a well-known lawyer in town and his sister, who works in public relations, with a strange sense of unreality. It was as if they were talking about complete strangers. What does that mean to them? I asked, returning the paper. Public condemnation is a powerful force. Noreen folded the paper, especially for people whose jobs depend on their reputations. She was right. A day later, it became known that one of Brooks's biggest clients, the Hampton Homes Construction Company, had canceled its contract with him. The official reason given was ethical considerations, but it was clear to everyone what the issue was. They don't want to be associated with a man who abandoned his own mother in the hospital and tried to embezzle her property, Noreen explained when she brought the news. For a construction company targeting family buyers, this is very bad PR. Things weren't going any better for Tabitha. At the PR agency where she worked, attitudes towards her had deteriorated dramatically. Clients didn't want their image to be created by someone with a tarnished reputation. She was removed from leading projects and transferred to internal work, with no contact with clients. All this news was brought to me by Noreen, who seemed to have sources of information everywhere. I listened to the fall of my children with cold satisfaction. They deserved to be punished for what they had done. No pity I felt. They had chosen this path for themselves when they chose to betray their own mother. The next day, Dr. Nielsen visited me. He examined my hip and was pleased with the results. The prosthesis is in place. The inflammation is subsiding, he said. I think we'll be able to discharge you in 2 or 3 days. And where will I go? I asked bitterly. My house is closed to me. Dr. Nielsen nodded understandingly. I've heard about your situation, and I'm sorry. But I have a suggestion. There's an excellent rehab center in Birmingham called Pine Forest. It's not a nursing home, it's a medical facility that helps you recover from surgery. You could spend a few weeks there while legal matters. I looked at him questioningly. Another facility instead of a home? It's a temporary solution, Mrs. Pryor, he added gently. And it has nothing to do with your children. It's my professional suggestion as your doctor. I realized I didn't have much choice. A hotel would be difficult with my mobility, and there were no other options. Okay, I finally agreed, but only temporarily, until the house is settled. Of course, Dr. Nielsen nodded. I'll make the arrangements. After he left, I shared the news with Noreen. Pine Forest is a great place, she approved. My aunt was rehabilitated there after a stroke. They have excellent specialists and all the facilities for recovery. I nodded, accepting the inevitable. At least it wasn't the boarding house the kids wanted me to go to. 2 days later, something unexpected happened. A nurse came into the room and informed me that Tabitha wanted to see me. I wasn't sure I was ready for this meeting, but curiosity got the better of me. Let her come in, I decided after a moment's hesitation. Tabitha looked gaunt and pale, with circles under her eyes. She hesitated at the door, as if she didn't know if she could come closer. Hi, Mom, she said quietly. Hello, Tabitha. I tried to keep my voice neutral. How are you feeling? She asked, taking a step forward. Better. I'm being discharged in a couple days. I know, she nodded. Dr. Nielsen said you're moving to Pine Forest. I stayed silent, waiting to see where she was going with this. Mom, I came to apologize, Tabitha finally said, her voice shaking. What we did, what Brooks did, it was wrong. Wrong? My voice sounded icy. It's a crime, Tabitha, and you were an accessory to it. I know. She lowered her head. There's no excuse for what we did. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. Sorry? I almost laughed. Regret won't bring back the 15,000 pounds Brooks stole from my account. Regret wouldn't undo the humiliation I'd felt when my own son had shouted, "Get out!" at me from the doorstep of my own house. Tabitha was silent, not looking up. Why did you come, Tabitha? I asked bluntly. What do you hope to gain? Forgiveness? A dismissal of the lawsuit? No, I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry. She finally looked up at me, tears in her eyes. And that I'd be willing to testify against Brooks if it would help you get your house and money back. I scrutinized her face, trying to determine if she was sincere or just trying to save her own skin. Are you betraying your brother like you betrayed me? I asked bitterly. I didn't betray you, Mom, Tabitha said quietly. I was weak. I let Brooks convince me that we were acting in your best interest, but I never meant to hurt you. And yet you did. My voice was firm. And now you're paying the consequences of your actions, just like Brooks. Tabitha nodded, accepting my judgment. I understand. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that I'm on your side. And if there's anything you need at the rehab center, I don't need anything from you, I interrupted. Not from you, not from Brooks. I'll handle this on my own, like I always had. Tabitha swallowed, clearly startled by the harshness of my words, but nodded. I understand. Just, get better, please. She turned to leave, but stopped at the door. Whatever you decide, Mom, I will respect your decision, and I'm really sorry. After she left, I sat for a long time, looking out the window and reflecting on our conversation. Part of me wanted to believe in the sincerity of her remorse, but another larger part of me remembered the betrayal and refused to trust. Too much had been said and done to just let it all go and forgive. 2 days later, as Dr. Nielsen had promised, I was discharged from the hospital. This time, everything was properly organized: special medical transport, nurses' escort, all necessary documents and medications. The Sosnovy Bor Rehabilitation Center turned out to be a pleasant surprise. Located in the suburbs of Birmingham, it looked more like a country hotel than a medical facility. The one-story building was surrounded by a pine forest, which is where the name came from. It was bright and spacious inside, with wide corridors for wheelchairs and walkers, comfortable handrails along the walls, and specially equipped rooms. I was assigned a small but cozy room overlooking the garden. The bed was comfortable and height adjustable, and the room had its own bathroom adapted for people with reduced mobility. There was a vase of fresh flowers on the bedside table, a small but nice touch that made the environment less sterile. Rehabilitation was intense but effective. The physical therapist, a young, energetic man named Ryan, put together an exercise program for me that gradually strengthened the muscles around the prosthesis and returned mobility. "You're making great progress, Mrs. Pryor," he said after a week of sessions. "Most patients your age recover much more slowly." "I'm well motivated," I replied with cold determination. "I'm going to go back to my house and make sure my children can never hurt me again." Ryan raised his eyebrows in surprise, but said nothing as he continued with the class. In addition to physical rehabilitation, the center offered psychological support. The psychologist, a woman in her 50s named Judith, tried to talk to me about forgiveness and healing emotional wounds, but I was adamant. "There are some things you can't forgive," I told her during our second meeting, "and betraying your own children is one of them. It's not them that need forgiveness, but you," Judith said softly, "to free yourself from the anger and resentment that eat away at your soul." "My anger gives me strength," I replied, "and I'm not going to give it up." Judith didn't insist, respecting my position, though she clearly disagreed with it. Noreen visited me regularly, bringing me news of the investigation. Brooks was going from bad to worse. Aside from losing a major client, he was under investigation by the bar for malpractice. "His career is pretty much ruined," Noreen reported during one of her visits. "No one wants to do business with a lawyer who cheats on his own mother." "And Tabitha?" I asked, remembering our last conversation. "She's cooperating with the investigation," Noreen replied. "She provided all the documents she had and testified against Brooks. That will probably save her from prosecution, though the reputational damage is still considerable." I nodded, feeling neither joy nor regret. They were both getting what they deserved. "What about my house?" That was the question that worried me the most. "Good news," Noreen smiled. "The court has made a preliminary ruling in your favor. The sale has been withdrawn, and your children are required to return the keys to the bailiff within 3 days. It was the first really good news I'd gotten in a long time. Soon I could go home, back to my walls, back to my life." "And the money?" I asked, remembering the £15,000 Brooks had taken out of my account. "Brooks promises to pay it back in full, plus interest and moral damages," Noreen said. "But so far these are just promises. We continue to insist on fulfillment." I knew victory was near. A few more weeks, and I could return to my home, to my independent life that my children had so carelessly tried to take from me. My physical strength was returning to me with each passing day. 2 weeks after arriving at the center, I could already walk with a cane instead of a walker, dress myself, and take a shower. These were small but important victories on the road to full independence. One morning, after a particularly successful physiotherapy session, I was sitting in the center's communal garden, enjoying the warm sunshine and watching the other patients. An elderly woman, with whom we sometimes exchanged greetings in the dining room, sat down next to me. "It's a nice day today, isn't it?" she said, looking up at the cloudless sky. Very nice, I agreed. I hear you're leaving us soon, she continued. Going home? Yes, I couldn't help smiling. Very soon. You're lucky, the woman sighed. I don't have anyone at home. After rehab, I'll have to move in with my daughter. I don't want to be a burden, but I have no choice. I looked at her with sympathy, remembering how recently I had been afraid of being in a similar situation. Do you have a good relationship with your daughter? I asked. Oh, yes, she's wonderful. The woman brightened. She visits me every day, brings me home-cooked food and flowers. She says she's happy that she can finally repay me for everything I've done for her. I nodded silently, thinking about how different parent-child relationships are. Some are lucky, and some, like me, have to fight for their rights against their own children. Do your children visit you? The woman asked. No, I answered briefly. We have a complicated relationship. Oh, I apologize. The woman looked embarrassed. I didn't mean to pry. It's okay, I smiled at her. You know, sometimes it's better to be alone than with people who betray your trust, even if those people are your own children. The woman looked at me in surprise, but didn't say anything. We sat there for a while, looking at the garden and thinking about our own thoughts. At that moment, I realized that I didn't feel unhappy or lonely, despite everything that had happened. On the contrary, I felt a strange calmness and confidence. I knew I could move on with my life, independent and dignified, without relying on children who didn't deserve my trust. I had a new chapter of life ahead of me, a life without betrayal and lies, without manipulation and control, a life where I would decide my own destiny. And I was ready for this new chapter, stronger and wiser than ever. The court hearing took place a month after my transfer to the Rehabilitation Center. By then, I was strong enough to attend in person, though the doctors recommended that I not overwork myself. Noreen insisted on my presence, believing it would make a stronger impression on the court and the jury. Let them see an old woman abandoned by her own children, she said as she helped me choose appropriate clothing for the trial. It's always more effective than testimony. We arrived at the courthouse half an hour before the start. The building was old, with high ceilings and echoing footsteps in the hallways. I walked slowly, leaning on my cane, and felt the curious stares of people passing by. Apparently, our case had caused some resonance in the city. The courtroom was full. Journalists from the local newspapers sat in the front rows, ready to cover the trial. At the prosecution table were Noreen and the prosecutor, a personable middle-aged man with a shrewd eye. At the defense table were Brooks and Tabitha's lawyers, both with tense faces. I sat next to Noreen, trying not to look in the direction of my children. But out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of them. Brooks looked sullen and gaunt, Tabitha pale and frightened. They sat apart, as if they didn't even want to be near each other. The session began with formalities. Then the prosecutor made a guilty plea, detailing the events of the day I was to be taken from the hospital and the consequences of their irresponsible actions. Mrs. Pryor, 76 years old, after a serious hip operation, with a doctor's express prohibition against moving about on her own, was left in the hospital by her own children who had promised to pick her up but had failed to do so. The prosecutor said, his words echoing around the room. In desperation, she was forced to drive herself home, risking her health and her life. And upon arrival, she discovered that her children had changed the locks and effectively rendered her homeless over her head. This is not just a domestic dispute, Your Honor. This is a felony. Then came the prosecution witnesses, Dr. Nielsen, Nurse Helen, the car rental employee, even Mrs. Birch, who called the ambulance when I passed out on the porch of my own home. Their testimony painted a clear picture of betrayal and indifference on the part of my children. The defense tried to portray the situation as a simple misunderstanding and an exaggerated reaction on my part. Brooks's attorney argued that his client was acting in good faith, concerned for my well-being in a situation where I was, in his opinion, unable to adequately assess my condition. Mr. Pryor and his sister were concerned that their mother, an elderly woman after surgery, would be living alone without proper care, the attorney said. Their intention was to ensure she lived comfortably and safely in a specialized facility. And to do that, they stole her money and tried to sell her house? Noreen parried, and laughter erupted in the audience. Tabitha's attorney took a more moderate line of defense, emphasizing that his client had been misled by her brother and was unaware of many of his actions. He also emphasized that Tabitha had cooperated with the investigation and was sincerely remorseful. When it came time for the testimony, I felt myself tense up. Noreen squeezed my hand reassuringly. "Just tell the truth," she whispered. "Don't embellish or minimize anything." I walked to the witness stand, leaning on my cane, and took the oath. Then, looking straight ahead, not at my children, but somewhere above their heads, I told my story simple and unemotional, just the facts. About waiting at the hospital, about trying unsuccessfully to call, about finally deciding to drive myself, about the pain and fear on the road, about the shock of finding the locks changed, about Brooks saying, "Get out." When I finished, there was silence in the hall. I risked a glance at the jury. Some of them shook their heads. Others looked at my children with obvious disapproval. Tabitha was crying, covering her face with her hands. Brooks sat with his head down, avoiding anyone's gaze. After cross-examination, during which the defense attorneys tried to catch me in contradictions but were unsuccessful, I returned to my seat. I felt strangely drained, as if the account of my misadventures had taken away the last vestiges of anger, leaving only fatigue. The closing speeches of the parties were brief. The prosecutor reiterated the gravity of the crime. Noreen focused on Brooks's financial machinations, and the defense attorneys made one last attempt to portray my children as victims of circumstance. The judge, an older man with a shrewd eye, took a long look at the evidence presented. His decision was unequivocal. Brooks and Tabitha were found guilty of abandonment, with Brooks additionally guilty of financial fraud. I don't often come across cases where children so blatantly neglect their duty to their parents, the judge said, looking at my children over his glasses. Your actions are not just irresponsible, they are criminal. You endangered the life and health of the man who gave you life and devoted his best years to you. Brooks received a suspended sentence of 1 year and 300 hours of community service and was ordered to return all embezzled funds with interest. Tabitha got off with probation and a fine, given her cooperation with the investigation and guilty plea. Both were ordered to undergo family therapy. In addition, the court ordered me to immediately return the keys to my house and restore all property rights. Any attempt by Brooks and Tabitha to dispose of my property without my written consent would henceforth be a criminal offense. When the judge finished pronouncing the verdict, I felt neither triumph nor joy, only quiet relief that justice had been served, and now I could move on with my life. As I walked out of the courtroom, I tried not to look at my children, but Tabitha came up to me on her own. "Mommy," she began in a trembling voice, "I would like to—" "Not now, Tabitha." I shook my head. "Maybe someday, but not now." She nodded understandingly and backed away. Brooks didn't even try to approach, standing back with a stone face, staring past me. "You handled yourself well," Noreen said as we stepped outside. "It was a clean win." "I'm not sure there are winners in these things," I replied tiredly. "But at least now I can go home." "About that," Noreen paused. "Are you sure you want to go back to the same house after everything that happened there?" I wondered. The thought of living again in a house where my own son was yelling "Get out" at me was unpleasant. But what else did I have? Where to go? I'll think about it, I finally said. While I'm back at the rehab center, I still need to complete my course of treatment. I was greeted with curiosity at Pine Forest. Many of the patients and staff knew about the court hearing, but I didn't share details, just said that everything ended safely. I needed time alone to reflect on what had happened and decide what to do next. That evening, Judith, the psychologist at the center, came to my room. I heard you had a rough day today, she said, sitting down in the chair next to my bed. Do you want to talk about it? Not particularly, I replied, but added nonetheless. There's one question that's been bugging me, though. Should I go back to my house, or should I start fresh in a new place? Judith thought for a moment, tapping her fingers on the armrest. How do you feel when you think about your home? She finally asked. I closed my eyes, imagining the familiar walls, the garden, the apple tree by the fence. But along with the warm memories came others, me on the porch, Brooks outside the window, his cruel words, then the darkness. I'm not sure I could feel safe there, I admitted. Too much had happened. Then maybe a new beginning is exactly what you need, Judith said softly. A home isn't just walls, but a sense of security, a sense of calm. If you can't find that in your old home, maybe you should look elsewhere. Her words struck a chord with me. That night, I couldn't sleep for a long time, thinking about the future. And by morning, I had made up my mind that I would not return to the old house. Instead, I would sell it and buy a new one in another neighborhood in Birmingham, where I could start my life anew without bitter memories. Noreen fully supported my decision. She helped me find a trustworthy realtor to handle the sale of the house, and at the same time began the search for a new home that fit my needs. Look for a small one-story cottage, I told the realtor when I met her, in a quiet neighborhood, but with good infrastructure. And be sure to have a garden. I can't live without a garden. The search took about 3 weeks. During that time, I completed the rehabilitation course and was deemed healthy enough to live independently. My hip was still occasionally sore when the weather changed, but overall the prosthesis fit well and I was able to walk with minimal support from a cane. Finally, the realtor found a suitable option, a cozy cottage on the outskirts of Birmingham in the Moseley neighborhood, known for its parks and peaceful atmosphere. The house was slightly smaller than my old one, but with a large garden and a spacious veranda. Most importantly, it was completely on one level, with no steps or thresholds, which was perfect for someone with my limitations. My old house sold quickly, at a good price. After paying the realtor's commission and buying a new home, I had a decent amount of money left over, which I put in a bank account as a financial cushion. Brooks, as ordered by the court, returned the stolen money with interest. The move took place in late spring, when the garden of the new house was in full bloom. I decided not to take the furniture from the old house. Too many memories. Instead, I bought new, simple, and functional, adapted for an elderly person. The only things I took from the past life, a few family photos, where I and Henry, but not our children, books, and my favorite porcelain statue, which my husband gave me for the 20th wedding anniversary. The first time in the new house was unusual and a little lonely, but gradually I got used to it and even began to enjoy my independence. No one told me what to do. No one controlled my actions. No one reminded me of my age and limitations. I was the master of my life, and this feeling of freedom was worth all the trials I had endured. The neighbors turned out to be friendly people. On the right lived a young couple with a small child. They sometimes dropped by for gardening advice, which I was fortunate to have in abundance. On the left was an elderly widow about my age, Mrs. Thompson, with whom we quickly hit it off and began taking morning walks together in the nearby park. Life was gradually getting better. I enrolled in gardening classes at the local community center and started attending a book club at the library. Gradually, my social circle expanded and the loneliness receded. Of course, there were moments of sadness and longing for what might have been if my relationship with my children had turned out differently. But I learned not to dwell on these thoughts and to find joy in the small, everyday pleasures. A cup of tea on the veranda, a new flower in the garden, an interesting book. Brooks and Tabitha tried to contact me several times after the trial, first through Noreen, then through social services. I didn't respond. I needed time to heal, and I wasn't sure I'd ever be ready to resume a relationship. One day, about 6 months after the move, I returned from a walk and found Tabitha on my doorstep. She was sitting on the steps, clearly having waited a long time for my return. She jumped up at the sight of me, fidgeting nervously with the strap of her bag. "Mom," she began hesitantly, "I know you don't want to see me, but please listen." I opened the door silently and gestured for her to come in, not because I forgave her, but because I didn't want to make a scene in front of the neighbors. Inside, Tabitha looked around with curiosity. "It's very nice," she said, sitting down in the chair she'd been offered. "It's bright and cozy." "Thank you," I replied dryly. "To what do I owe this visit?" Tabitha took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "I came to apologize," she said finally. "Again, and I know words can't fix anything, but it's important that you know how sorry I am for what happened." I listened in silence, not interrupting. "I've been thinking a lot these past few months," Tabitha continued, "about why I'd let Brooks manipulate me, why I hadn't stood up to his plans. And I realized it wasn't just him. I'd been selfish myself, thinking only of my own comfort." She was silent, waiting for my reaction, but I just nodded, inviting her to continue. "A lot of things changed after the trial." Tabitha lowered her eyes. "Brooks lost his license to practice law. I still work at the agency, but in a much lower position. A lot of friends turned their backs on us when they found out what happened, but that's not even the point." She looked at me again, tears welling up in her eyes. "The point is that I've lost the most precious thing of all, your trust and your love, and I would give anything to get them back." I looked at my daughter, at her sincere remorse, and part of me wanted to forgive, to hug her, to tell her that everything would be okay. But the other part, the stronger part, remembered the betrayal, remembered the pain and humiliation, remembered the coldness of being alone in a hospital room. "Why did you come here, Tabitha?" I asked you straight out. "What do you want from me?" She hesitated, and in that confusion I saw the truth. "This isn't just about reconciliation, is it?" I continued. "There's something else." "It's Brooks," Tabitha finally admitted. "He's in serious financial trouble after losing his job. He can't find a new one with that stain on his reputation. He's being evicted from his apartment for non-payment. And you thought I could help?" I felt the bitterness rising inside. "After everything you've done?" "Not us," Tabitha corrected quickly. "I didn't talk to Brooks about coming to you. He's too proud to ask for help. But I thought, you've always been such a caring mother. Maybe you can find it in your heart to forgive me." "Forgiveness?" I shook my head. "Tabitha, you come to my house after months of silence, with feigned remorse, and ask for money for a brother who tried to rob me of everything I had?" "No, not like that." Tabitha looked frightened. "I am truly remorseful, Mom, and I never would have asked if Brooks hadn't been in such a desperate situation." I stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. "I'm glad you still have a job, Tabitha," I said calmly, "and I wish you all the best in life. But I'm not giving a penny to Brooks or you. And I don't want to see you in my house again. Neither of you showed any real concern when I was sick. All you care about is my money and my property, and that hasn't changed. Mom, please." Tabitha stood up too, panic in her eyes. "You can't just cut us out of your life. We're your children." "Children?" I grinned bitterly. Children don't betray their parents. Children don't try to sell their mother's house behind her back. Children don't come with their hands outstretched when they need money after months of silence. I walked to the door and opened it. Goodbye, Tabitha. I hope you and Brooks learn to live without my financial support, like I've learned to live without your emotional support. She was still trying to say something, but I was adamant. When the door closed behind her, I felt not bitterness, but a strange relief. It was as if the last thread tying me to the past had finally been severed. I returned to the garden, to my flowers, to the peaceful life I had built for myself after all my trials. The sun was setting, coloring the sky golden. Somewhere not far away, children were playing, their laughter echoing through the hedges. My neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, waved at me from the other side of the fence, inviting me to afternoon tea. In that moment, I realized I was finally free from the resentments, from the anger, from the toxic relationships that had poisoned my life. I had built a new home, not just of bricks and wood, but of acceptance, peace of mind, and dignity. And no one else can take that away from me.